Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez had always been told she was too small for aviation. At 5 feet 2 inches, she barely met the minimum height requirement for Army helicopter pilots. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, never let her forget it. Every briefing, every training exercise, every routine check-in became an opportunity for him to remind her that she was an anomaly in his unit. The other pilots respected her skills, but Harrison's constant undermining had created a toxic environment that made every day a battle for legitimacy. The morning started like any other at Fort Campbell. Rebecca performed her pre-flight inspection on the US-60 Black Hawk with meticulous care, checking every bolt, every wire, every fluid level. Her crew chief, Sergeant Mike Thompson, had worked with her for 2 years and trusted her completely. They were scheduled for a routine training mission over the Kentucky countryside, nothing that should have challenged her experience level. But as Rebecca would learn, routine could turn deadly in seconds. Colonel Harrison appeared at the hangar just as Rebecca finished her inspection. His presence always made the air feel heavier, more oppressive. He approached with his characteristic swagger, clipboard in hand, looking for any excuse to find fault with her preparation. "Martinez," he called out, his voice carrying across the concrete floor. "I've been reviewing your flight logs. Your landing times are consistently slower than the male pilots in your unit." Rebecca bit back her initial response. She had learned that defending herself only gave Harrison more ammunition. Instead, she stood at attention and replied, "Sir, my landing times meet all safety standards and mission requirements." The truth was, her times were actually more precise than most of her colleagues, but Harrison had a way of twisting statistics to support his narrative. "Standards are minimums, Martinez. This unit demands excellence." Harrison stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his morning coffee. "I'm beginning to question whether you have what it takes for combat deployment. Maybe you'd be better suited for transport missions." The implication was clear. Transport missions were considered less prestigious, less important. It was his way of suggesting she didn't belong with the elite pilots. Sergeant Thompson cleared his throat, drawing Harrison's attention. "Sir, Lieutenant Martinez has the best safety record in the unit. 0 incidents, 0 maintenance issues caused by pilot error." Thompson's loyalty meant everything to Rebecca, but she also knew it would likely cost him later. Harrison didn't appreciate enlisted personnel defending officers he was trying to break. Harrison's expression darkened. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Sergeant." He turned back to Rebecca. "You're cleared for today's mission, but I'll be monitoring your performance closely. One mistake, Martinez, and I'll have grounds for a full evaluation of your capabilities." With that threat hanging in the air, he walked away, leaving Rebecca to wonder if today would be the day he found his excuse. The mission briefing was standard. They would fly a predetermined route, practice emergency procedures, and return to base. Rebecca had flown similar missions hundreds of times. As she strapped into the pilot's seat, she felt the familiar calm that came with being in control of something she understood completely. The helicopter was complex, but it was predictable. Unlike dealing with Harrison, flying made sense. The Black Hawk lifted off smoothly, its rotors cutting through the morning air with mechanical precision. Rebecca felt the familiar sensation of leaving the ground, the moment when the aircraft transitioned from earthbound machine to flying marvel. Beside her, her co-pilot Lieutenant David Chen ran through the standard checklist, his voice steady and professional over the intercom. The crew chief and medic sat in the back, strapped in and ready for whatever the training exercise might throw at them. They were 20 minutes into the flight when the first sign of trouble appeared. A slight vibration in the cyclic stick, barely noticeable to an inexperienced pilot, but Rebecca had enough hours to know that helicopters didn't develop new vibrations without reason. She mentioned it to Chen, who nodded and made a note in the flight log. They would check it during post-flight inspection, but for now, it wasn't severe enough to abort the mission. The countryside below stretched out in rolling hills and scattered farms. Kentucky in early spring was beautiful from the air, all fresh green and promise. Rebecca allowed herself a moment to appreciate the view, knowing that these peaceful training flights were preparation for deployments that would be anything but peaceful. The radio crackled with routine communications from the control tower, weather updates, and position reports from other aircraft in the area. Then the vibration became more pronounced. Rebecca's hands, experienced from thousands of hours of flight time, detected the subtle change immediately. The cyclic stick, which controlled the helicopter's forward, backward, and sideways movement, was developing a concerning shake. She glanced at Chen, who was already reaching for the emergency procedures manual. They both knew that mechanical failures in helicopters could escalate quickly. "Tower, this is Army 772, Rebecca transmitted, her voice calm despite the growing concern. "We're experiencing some mechanical issues and may need to return to base." The response came back immediately, clearing them for priority return and asking for details about the nature of the problem. Rebecca appreciated the professionalism of the air traffic controllers, who understood that helicopter emergencies required immediate attention. Chen was running through the emergency checklist, his finger tracing down the laminated pages. "Vibration in flight controls," he read aloud. "Check hydraulic pressure, check engine parameters, prepare for possible auto-rotation." The words were clinical, but they both understood the implications. If they lost hydraulic pressure, controlling the helicopter would become exponentially more difficult. The vibration suddenly intensified, and Rebecca felt the cyclic stick jerk in her hands. This was no longer a minor maintenance issue. Something was failing and failing quickly. She applied gentle pressure to maintain control, but the helicopter was beginning to respond erratically to her inputs. The nose wanted to pitch up unexpectedly, then swing to the left without any input from her. "We need to get on the ground now," Rebecca said, her training taking over. She began looking for suitable landing sites, her eyes scanning the terrain below for anything flat and open enough to accommodate an emergency landing. The problem was that Kentucky's rolling hills didn't offer many options. Most fields were either too small, too steep, or filled with obstacles that would make landing dangerous. Chen was on the radio, declaring an emergency and requesting immediate assistance. Rebecca could hear the tension in his voice, though he was maintaining professional composure. Behind them, Sergeant Thompson was securing equipment and preparing the crew for what might be a hard landing. Everyone was doing their job, but Rebecca knew that ultimately, getting them safely on the ground was her responsibility. The helicopter shuddered violently, and Rebecca felt the cyclic stick nearly wrench itself from her grip. The mechanical failure was escalating faster than Rebecca had anticipated. The cyclic stick was now bucking in her hands like a wild animal, requiring all her strength to maintain any semblance of control. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air, and her forearms burned from the constant struggle against the malfunctioning controls. She had trained for this scenario countless times in simulators, but the reality was more violent, more unpredictable than any training exercise could replicate. "Hydraulic pressure is dropping," Chen reported, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored the instrument panel. The loss of hydraulic pressure meant that the controls would become increasingly difficult to operate, requiring more physical strength to achieve the same response. For a pilot of Rebecca's size, this was a significant concern. The helicopter had been designed assuming the pilot would have the upper body strength of an average male soldier. Below them, the landscape was becoming more challenging. They were approaching a section of Kentucky known for its steep ridges and narrow valleys. The ideal landing spot would be a large, flat field with no obstacles, but those were becoming scarce. Rebecca spotted a pasture that might work, but it was bordered by power lines on one side and a barn on the other. The margin for error was minimal, and with failing controls, minimal margins were dangerous. The helicopter suddenly lurched to the right despite Rebecca's attempt to maintain straight flight. She fought against the controls, her muscles straining to keep the aircraft level. The horizon tilted crazily outside the windscreen, and she could hear equipment shifting in the cabin behind her. Sergeant Thompson's voice came over the intercom, calm but urgent. "We're ready for emergency landing back here." Rebecca's mind raced through the possibilities. They could attempt an auto-rotation, where the helicopter would essentially glide to the ground using the momentum of the spinning rotors. But auto-rotations required precise control inputs, and her controls were becoming increasingly unreliable. The other option was to try to reach the nearest airport, but that was still 15 minutes away, and she wasn't sure they had 15 minutes. The decision was made for her when the hydraulic pressure warning light began flashing red. They were now in a true emergency situation where every second counted. Rebecca keyed the radio microphone with her chin, her hands too busy fighting the controls to reach for it normally. Tower, Army 772 is declaring emergency. We're going down in Sector 7, requesting immediate rescue response. Chen was already calculating their best approach angle to the pasture below. "Come left 20 degrees," he advised. "That'll line us up with the longest section of field." Rebecca attempted to comply, but the helicopter's response was sluggish and erratic. What should have been a smooth turn became a series of jerky movements that made her stomach lurch. The pasture was approaching rapidly now, and Rebecca could see the details that would determine whether they survived this landing. The grass looked recently cut, which was good for visibility but bad for cushioning. There were no obvious holes or ditches, but she could see ruts from farm equipment that could catch the landing gear. The power lines on the eastern border seemed to loom larger as they descended. Then, without warning, the cyclic stick seized completely. Rebecca pulled with all her strength, but the control that governed the helicopter's attitude was completely locked in position. The helicopter immediately began to pitch nose down, accelerating toward the ground at an alarming rate. She had perhaps 30 seconds before impact, and no way to change their trajectory. "Brace for impact," she shouted over the intercom, though her crew was already preparing for the worst. This was the moment every pilot dreaded, when training and experience collided with mechanical reality, and the laws of physics took over. The helicopter was diving toward the ground at a terrifying angle, the pasture rushing up to meet them like a green wall. Rebecca's hands were locked on the immovable cyclic stick, her knuckles white with the effort of trying to pull the aircraft out of its death spiral. The engine was still running, the rotors still turning, but without the ability to change the helicopter's attitude. They were essentially a very expensive rock falling from the sky. In the back of her mind, she could hear Colonel Harrison's voice from earlier that morning. "One mistake, Martinez, and I'll have grounds for a full evaluation of your capabilities." The irony wasn't lost on her that his threats might become irrelevant in the next few seconds. But Rebecca hadn't survived years of Harrison's harassment to die in a Kentucky pasture. There had to be something she could do. Chen was shouting altitude readings over the intercom. 200 feet, 150, 100. Each number was a countdown to impact, but Rebecca forced herself to think through the problem analytically. The cyclic stick was seized, but there might be other ways to affect the helicopter's attitude. She looked desperately at the other controls, searching for any option that might save them. The collective lever, which controlled the helicopter's vertical movement, was still responsive. She could feel it moving smoothly in her left hand, but raising Collective would only slow their descent slightly without changing their nose-down attitude. The anti-torque pedals still worked, but they controlled yaw rotation, not pitch. Nothing in her extensive training had prepared her for this specific combination of failures. 50 feet from the ground, Rebecca noticed something that made her heart race even faster. The cyclic stick wasn't just seized. She could see that the mechanical linkage had partially separated. A metal cable that should have been taut was hanging loose, dangling just inches from her face. The connection between the stick and the actual control surfaces was physically broken, which explained why her inputs weren't reaching the helicopter's systems. 30 feet from impact, an idea formed in Rebecca's mind. It was desperate, dangerous, and probably impossible, but it was the only option left. The loose cable end was close enough to reach, but her hands were needed on the other controls. She would have to use her teeth to grab the cable and pull it back into position, hopping to restore even partial control of the helicopter's attitude. 20 feet from the ground, Rebecca released her grip on the useless cyclic stick and lunged forward, her mouth opening to grab the dangling cable. The metallic taste was immediate and unpleasant, but she bit down hard, feeling the steel fibers cut into her gums. With her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, she began pulling backward with her neck muscles, trying to restore tension to the control linkage. The helicopter's nose came up slightly, just enough to change their trajectory from a direct dive to a steep but survivable approach angle. Rebecca maintained her grip on the cable, her teeth cutting deeper into the metal as she fought to keep the helicopter's attitude stable. Blood filled her mouth, but she didn't dare let go. 10 feet from the ground, she felt the cable suddenly snap taut in her mouth. The connection was restored, and she could feel the helicopter responding to her desperate improvisation. The nose came up another few degrees, and their rate of descent slowed dramatically. It wasn't a perfect landing approach, but it might be enough to save their lives. 5 feet from the ground, Rebecca braced for impact while still maintaining her grip on the cable. The helicopter hit the pasture hard, bouncing once before settling into the soft earth. The landing gear absorbed most of the impact, but the aircraft tilted dangerously to one side before coming to rest. The sudden silence after the engine shut down was deafening. Rebecca remained frozen in position for several seconds, the metallic cable still clenched between her teeth, blood trickling down her chin. Her neck muscles screamed in protest from the unnatural angle, and she could taste copper mixed with the industrial flavor of the steel cable. Slowly, carefully, she opened her mouth and released her grip on the improvised control linkage. Chen was the first to speak, his voice shaky but relieved. "Jesus, Rebecca, I can't believe that worked." He was already running through the post-crash checklist, shutting down systems and checking for fuel leaks or fire hazards. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Rebecca could see the tremor in his fingers. They had all felt how close they had come to a very different outcome. From the back of the aircraft, Sergeant Thompson's voice came over the intercom. All crew members are conscious and mobile. No apparent injuries back here. Rebecca tried to respond, but found that her mouth was too damaged to speak clearly. The cable had cut deep grooves in her gums and tongue, and several of her teeth felt loose. She gave Chen a thumbs up instead, then began her own assessment of the aircraft's condition. The helicopter was damaged but intact. The landing gear had absorbed most of the impact, though the left skid was visibly bent. More importantly, there was no sign of fire or fuel leakage, which meant they weren't in immediate danger of explosion. Rebecca attempted to move the cyclic stick and confirmed that it was once again completely unresponsive. Whatever temporary fix her desperate improvisation had provided, it was no longer working. Emergency vehicles were already visible in the distance, their lights flashing as they raced across the countryside toward the crash site. Rebecca knew that within minutes, they would be surrounded by paramedics, investigators, and probably Colonel Harrison. The thought of facing Harrison after what he would undoubtedly classify as a pilot error incident made her stomach clench. But she was alive, her crew was alive, and that was what mattered most. Chen helped her out of the pilot's seat, supporting her arm as she stepped down onto the Kentucky grass. Her legs were shaky from the adrenaline crash, and the taste of blood in her mouth was making her nauseous. She spat several times, trying to clear the metallic flavor, but the cuts in her mouth would need medical attention. The medic from their crew was already approaching with a first aid kit. "Ma'am, I need to check your mouth," Corporal Lisa Rodriguez said, her voice professional but concerned. "I can see you're bleeding pretty badly." Rebecca nodded and opened her mouth, wincing as the medic shone a flashlight inside. The damage was extensive. Several deep cuts on her gums and tongue, and at least 2 teeth were definitely loose. She would need a dentist, possibly surgery. As the emergency vehicles arrived, Rebecca found herself thinking about the cable she had bitten. It was a desperate move, something no training manual had ever suggested, something that by all rights should have failed. But it had worked, at least long enough to save their lives. She wondered if anyone would believe her when she described what had happened. The physical evidence was there in her mouth, but the story seemed too incredible to be true. Sergeant Thompson appeared at her side, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "Lieutenant, I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of flying. That was the most badass thing I've ever witnessed." He paused, then added more quietly, "But you're hurt pretty bad. We need to get you to a hospital." Rebecca attempted to smile but found that the movement was too painful. Instead, she squeezed his shoulder in acknowledgement. The first ambulance reached them, and paramedics began their assessment of the crew. The paramedics worked with efficient professionalism, checking each crew member for injuries while asking detailed questions about the crash. Rebecca found herself trying to explain what had happened, but the damage to her mouth made speaking difficult and painful. Every word came out slurred and accompanied by fresh blood. The lead paramedic, a woman named Janet, kept telling her to stop talking and let them work. "Looks like you've got some significant oral trauma," Janet said, shining a penlight into Rebecca's mouth. "We need to get you to the hospital for proper evaluation, but from what I can see, you're going to need dental surgery. Some of these cuts are pretty deep, and those loose teeth need immediate attention." Rebecca nodded, wincing as the movement caused fresh pain to shoot through her jaw. Chen was being checked for back injuries, a standard precaution after any hard landing. He kept looking over at Rebecca with an expression of amazement and concern. "You realize what you did was impossible, right?" he said as a paramedic examined his spine. "I mean, physically impossible. No one should be able to generate enough force with their jaw muscles to operate helicopter controls." Rebecca tried to shrug, but even that small movement hurt. The sound of approaching helicopters drew everyone's attention skyward. The rescue birds were arriving, along with what was undoubtedly a command helicopter carrying senior officers. Rebecca's heart sank as she recognized the distinctive markings of Colonel Harrison's aircraft. Within minutes, she would have to face his questions and probably his accusations. The fact that she had saved 4 lives wouldn't matter to him if he could find a way to blame her for the mechanical failure. Sergeant Thompson was helping the crash investigation team document the scene, pointing out the damaged control linkage and explaining what he had witnessed from the crew chief's position. Rebecca could see him gesturing toward her, then toward the helicopter, his animated explanation clearly impressing the investigators. At least someone would be able to corroborate her story when the inevitable board of inquiry convened. Colonel Harrison's helicopter landed about 50 yards away, kicking up a cloud of dust and grass. Rebecca watched through the ambulance window as he climbed out, his expression grim and purposeful. He spoke briefly with the incident commander, then began walking toward the crashed aircraft. Rebecca knew that his primary concern wouldn't be the welfare of his personnel, but rather how this incident would reflect on his command. The ambulance doors opened, and Harrison approached with 2 other officers Rebecca didn't recognize. His first words were exactly what she had expected. "Martinez, I want to know exactly what happened here. This is the kind of incident that brings unwanted attention to our unit. No inquiry about injuries, no relief that everyone had survived, just immediate concern about how this would affect his career." Janet, the paramedic, stepped between Harrison and the ambulance. "Sir, this pilot needs immediate medical attention. She can't speak clearly right now, and she needs to get to a hospital. Any interviews will have to wait until after she's been treated." Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward the civilian paramedic who was willing to stand up to a military colonel. Harrison's expression darkened. "This is a military matter, and I need to debrief my pilot immediately. These are national security issues that take precedence over minor injuries." Rebecca saw Janet's jaw tighten at the phrase minor injuries. The paramedic had seen the extent of the damage to Rebecca's mouth and knew that calling it minor was both medically inaccurate and callously insensitive. "Colonel, with respect, this pilot has suffered significant oral trauma and possible jaw fractures. She physically cannot provide a coherent debrief right now. The hospital is 20 minutes away, and every minute we delay increases the risk of permanent damage." Janet's voice was calm but firm, the tone of a medical professional who wouldn't be intimidated by rank or authority. Behind Harrison, one of the crash investigators was approaching with a piece of the broken control linkage in his hand. "Sir, you need to see this. The failure was catastrophic, and frankly, I'm amazed they got this bird on the ground at all." Harrison turned to examine the evidence, giving Rebecca a moment to catch Chen's eye. Her co-pilot was nodding at her, a gesture of support and admiration that meant more than any medal. The hospital emergency room was a blur of activity and sterile white surfaces. Rebecca found herself on a gurney, staring up at fluorescent lights while doctors and nurses moved around her with practiced efficiency. The local anesthetic they had injected into her gums was beginning to take effect, numbing the worst of the pain but leaving her mouth feeling swollen and foreign. She could finally speak, though her words came out thick and distorted. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the oral surgeon, was examining the damage with obvious concern. "I've never seen injuries quite like this," she said, her voice puzzled. "The pattern of cuts suggests you bit down on something with tremendous force, but the metal fragments I'm finding are consistent with aircraft cable. Can you tell me what happened?" Rebecca attempted to explain, but even with the anesthetic, talking was difficult. A nurse was cleaning the smaller cuts while Dr. Mitchell worked on the more serious damage. "You've got 2 teeth that are definitely going to need to be removed," she explained. "The roots are severely damaged, probably from the pressure you exerted. I can save most of the others, but you're looking at several weeks of healing time, and your bite is going to be different permanently." Rebecca nodded, understanding that she was lucky to have any teeth left at all. The door opened, and Chen entered, still wearing his flight suit but looking more composed than he had at the crash site. Behind him was Captain Rodriguez from the Incident Investigation Team, carrying a thick folder of preliminary findings. Rebecca tried to sit up, but Dr. Mitchell gently pushed her back down. "You're not going anywhere for at least another hour," the surgeon said firmly. "How are you feeling?" Chen asked, his concern evident. Rebecca gave him a thumbs up, the best she could manage with her mouth full of surgical instruments. Captain Rodriguez pulled out a voice recorder and set it on the bedside table. Lieutenant Martinez, when you're ready, I need to get your statement about what happened up there. The preliminary findings are unusual. Rebecca nodded, indicating she was ready to try. Dr. Mitchell stepped back, giving Rebecca space to speak. The cyclic control ceased completely about 2 minutes before impact, she began, her words slurred but understandable. I could see the control cable had separated from the linkage. With my hands on the collective and my feet on the pedals, the only way to reach it was with my teeth. Captain Rodriguez was writing furiously, clearly struggling to believe what he was hearing. So you bit down on a steel aircraft cable and pulled it back into position while controlling a helicopter in emergency descent? Rodriguez asked, his tone suggesting he found the story difficult to accept. Rebecca nodded again, then pointed to her mouth. The evidence is pretty clear, she said, attempting a smile that came out more like a grimace. Chen leaned forward. Captain, I was right there. I saw the whole thing. When Lieutenant Martinez grabbed that cable, it was like watching someone perform surgery with their teeth. The helicopter's attitude changed immediately, and that's the only reason we're all alive. His testimony carried the weight of eyewitness credibility, and Rodriguez made more notes. Dr. Mitchell held up a small metal fragment with her tweezers. This is a piece of aircraft cable, she said. I've removed several pieces from the patient's gums and tongue. The wear pattern suggests sustained pressure under extreme stress. From a medical standpoint, what she's describing is consistent with the injuries I'm treating. Rebecca felt vindicated by the surgeon's professional opinion. Captain Rodriguez closed his folder and turned off the recorder. Lieutenant, I've been investigating military aircraft incidents for 15 years, and I've never encountered anything like this. The fact that you thought to use your teeth as a backup control system, and that you had the jaw strength to actually affect the aircraft's attitude is remarkable. You saved 4 lives today. Rebecca felt tears welling in her eyes, partly from relief and partly from the pain medication. The door opened again, and Colonel Harrison entered with 2 other senior officers. His expression was unreadable, but Rebecca could sense his discomfort with the situation. A pilot under his command had become a hero, but it was a hero he had been trying to drive out of the service. Colonel Harrison approached Rebecca's bed with the stiff posture of a man who had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Behind him, the 2 senior officers, a general Rebecca didn't recognize, and a woman wearing the insignia of a full colonel, observed the interaction with obvious interest. Rebecca attempted to sit up straighter, but Dr. Mitchell placed a firm hand on her shoulder, keeping her in place. Martinez, Harrison began, his voice lacking its usual edge of criticism, I've been briefed on the incident. The investigation team tells me you improvised a solution to a catastrophic mechanical failure. He paused, clearly struggling with how to frame what had happened. Your actions saved the lives of your crew and prevented the loss of a valuable aircraft. The words seemed to physically pain him to speak. The general stepped forward, his expression much warmer than Harrison's. "Lieutenant Martinez, I'm General Patricia Walsh from Army Aviation Command. I came here as soon as I heard about the incident. What you did today was extraordinary, and I wanted to personally thank you for your quick thinking and courage." Rebecca tried to respond, but her mouth was still too damaged for clear speech. Dr. Mitchell spoke for her patient. "General, Lieutenant Martinez is going to be in surgery for several more hours. The damage to her mouth is extensive, and she's going to need significant recovery time. I'd recommend postponing any formal debriefings until she's had at least a week to heal." The surgeon's tone made it clear that this was a medical directive, not a suggestion. Colonel Harrison's expression tightened. "General, with respect, we have procedures for incident investigation. Time is critical for accurate recall of events." Rebecca could see him calculating how to spin the situation to minimize any reflection on his leadership. A heroic pilot in his unit was good for his career, but a pilot he had been harassing was potentially problematic. The woman colonel, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Colonel Harrison, I've reviewed Lieutenant Martinez's personnel file. Her performance ratings show a pattern of criticism that seems inconsistent with her safety record and flight hours. I'm curious about that discrepancy." Rebecca watched Harrison's face flush slightly. Someone was finally asking the right questions about his treatment of her. General Walsh picked up a clipboard from the bedside table. "Lieutenant, I see here that you've been recommended for several advanced training opportunities that were never approved. Can you tell me why?" Rebecca pointed to her mouth, indicating she couldn't speak clearly, but she looked directly at Harrison. The message was clear to everyone in the room. Chen, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. "General, if I may, Lieutenant Martinez has been subjected to constant questioning of her abilities despite having the best safety record in our unit. Many of us have wondered why someone with her skills and dedication hasn't been given opportunities for advancement." Rebecca felt grateful for Chen's willingness to speak up, knowing it could affect his own career. Dr. Mitchell was growing visibly annoyed with the military politics playing out in her emergency room. "Gentlemen and ma'am, I need to continue treating my patient. She's lost a significant amount of blood, and I still have surgical work to do. This discussion needs to happen somewhere else." The surgeon's authority in her own domain was absolute, and even generals had to respect it. General Walsh nodded to Dr. Mitchell, then turned back to Rebecca. "Lieutenant, when you're recovered, I'd like to speak with you privately about your experiences in this unit. What happened today demonstrates exceptional skill and courage, but I'm concerned about the environment you've been working in." Rebecca managed a slight nod, understanding that someone was finally going to investigate Harrison's behavior. As the group prepared to leave, Harrison lingered for a moment. "Martinez, I want you to know that I'll be recommending you for commendation for your actions today." His voice was quiet, lacking conviction. Rebecca looked at him steadily, her expression conveying more than words could. They both knew that this incident had changed the dynamic between them permanently. The door closed behind the officers, leaving Rebecca alone with Dr. Mitchell and the nursing staff. "That was interesting," the surgeon commented dryly. "I've treated a lot of military personnel, and I've never seen that kind of tension between a commander and someone who just saved lives." Rebecca tried to smile, but the movement was still too painful. Justice, she thought, sometimes comes in unexpected forms. 3 weeks later, Rebecca sat in General Walsh's office at Army Aviation Command Headquarters, her mouth still tender but functional enough for normal conversation. The dental work had been extensive, 2 teeth extracted, several others repaired, and ongoing treatment for nerve damage. But she was alive, her crew was alive, and that was all that mattered. The formal investigation had concluded with a finding of mechanical failure and exceptional pilot performance under emergency conditions. "Lieutenant Martinez," General Walsh began, settling into her chair across from Rebecca, "I've completed my review of your unit's personnel practices. What I found was troubling, to say the least." She opened a thick folder filled with documents, testimony transcripts, and performance evaluations. "Colonel Harrison's treatment of you appears to have been discriminatory and unprofessional. More importantly, it created an environment that could have compromised safety and morale." Rebecca felt a mixture of vindication and nervousness. She had hoped someone would eventually investigate Harrison's behavior, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly or at such a high level. "General, I just want to be clear that I never filed a formal complaint. I was trying to handle the situation through normal channels." Her voice was still slightly affected by the dental work, but she was understandable. "I'm aware of that," Walsh replied. "But the incident 3 weeks ago brought attention to your situation in a way that couldn't be ignored. When a pilot performs an act of heroism that saves lives, and then we discover that same pilot has been systematically undermined by her commanding officer, it raises serious questions about leadership and judgment." The general's expression was grave, indicating the seriousness of the situation. Walsh pulled out a transcript of interviews with other pilots in Rebecca's unit. "I spoke with 12 of your colleagues. Every single one of them described Harrison's treatment of you as excessive and inappropriate. Several mentioned that they had considered speaking up but were afraid of retaliation." Rebecca wasn't surprised by this revelation, but it was validating to know that her colleagues had recognized the problem. "The most damning testimony came from your maintenance chief," Walsh continued. "He told me that Harrison had been pressuring him to find fault with your aircraft inspections, even when there were no issues. That's not just harassment, Lieutenant. That's a safety violation that could have endangered lives. Rebecca felt her anger rising. She had suspected that Harrison was interfering with her flights, but she hadn't realized the extent of his manipulation. Walsh leaned forward. Colonel Harrison has been relieved of command effective immediately. He's being transferred to a desk job pending a full investigation by the Inspector General's office. The new unit commander will be Colonel Sarah Peterson, who has an excellent reputation for fairness and professionalism. Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wouldn't have to face Harrison's hostility every day anymore. "There's more," Walsh said, pulling out another document. "Based on your performance record and the extraordinary courage you displayed during the emergency, you're being recommended for several things. First, the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions during the incident. Second, immediate promotion to captain. And third, acceptance into the Army's test pilot program if you're interested." Rebecca's eyes widened. These were opportunities she had dreamed about but never expected to receive. "General, I'm honored, but I want to make sure I'm being recommended based on my qualifications, not just because of what happened during the crash." Rebecca had worked too hard to accept advancement that felt like compensation for harassment. She wanted to earn her promotions through skill and dedication, not sympathy. Walsh smiled. "Lieutenant, I've reviewed your entire flight record. Your safety statistics, your training scores, your leadership evaluations from subordinates. Everything indicates that you should have been promoted and given advanced opportunities years ago. The crash incident simply brought attention to what should have been obvious all along." Rebecca felt tears of relief and gratitude welling in her eyes. "What about my crew?" Rebecca asked. "Sergeant Thompson and the others were just as brave as I was. They deserve recognition too." Walsh nodded approvingly. "Already taken care of. Thompson is getting the Air Medal and the others are receiving commendations. Good leaders take care of their people, and you've just demonstrated that quality." Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since the crash. 6 months later, Captain Rebecca Martinez stood in the test pilot facility at Edwards Air Force Base, preparing for her first flight in an experimental helicopter. The aircraft was sleek and futuristic, incorporating fly-by-wire technology that would eliminate the kind of mechanical failure that had nearly killed her and her crew. She ran her hand along the smooth composite fuselage, marveling at how far aviation technology had advanced. Her new commander, Colonel Peterson, had been everything General Walsh had promised: fair, professional, and supportive of her career development. Under Peterson's leadership, Rebecca had thrived, taking on increasingly challenging assignments and earning the respect of her peers through skill, rather than having to constantly prove herself. The toxic environment that Harrison had created seemed like a distant memory. The test pilot program was demanding but rewarding. Rebecca was working on helicopters that would be flying combat missions 10 years in the future, incorporating lessons learned from current operations and advancing the state of the art. Her experience with emergency procedures and mechanical failures had made her particularly valuable to the program. She understood viscerally how important reliability was in military aviation. Her mouth had healed well, though she still bore the scars of her desperate improvisation. Two artificial teeth had replaced the ones she had lost, and while her bite was slightly different, she had full function. The dentist had marveled at the healing process, noting that her jaw muscles had actually strengthened from the extreme stress she had placed on them during the emergency. Chen visited occasionally, bringing news from their old unit. He was now a senior,